All right, so we'll kind of use last week's slides. What I had in there was kind of the next thing I'm going to go over. So if you want to kind of follow along, or if you haven't pulled up, that was just the week 11 slides. We'll kind of start at this amateurism point, right? So basically, we'll primarily be focusing on kind of U.S., I guess, amateur sports. We'll kind of go through the history a little bit, look at some of the numbers. I've got an Excel document I'll kind of use to kind of go along with this that I'll show you. And at the end, I'll probably mention a little bit about kind of what the next week and a half or so looks like. So we'll kind of do that towards the end of class. We'll kind of jump into material right over, kind of here at the beginning. That homework assignment is currently out there. It's due at the end of the, was it the day? Let me see. Thursday, right? Is that what it has? It's okay, good. So if you want to turn that into me today, you can. I kind of mentioned last week, we won't be having class Thursday. I'll put up a video in replace of class. I'll be kind of going over, wherever we stop today, kind of talking about amateurism, and then we'll pick up wherever I leave off in that video on Tuesday when we meet in class. Okay. If you have any questions, though, I should be available via email Thursday and Friday, even though I won't physically be in the building. And then I also got up the next homework. If you want to start working on it, the due date's quite a bit in the future, about 2 weeks into the future. But some of the material we've already covered. So if you want an early start on that, that's up there. I think right now the first 3 questions are about discrimination, so you could get through those. The last 2 questions are going to be stuff that we kind of cover over the next week and a half or so. Okay. Any questions before we jump into the next topic material? Excuse me. So let's dive into it. So, I guess we could go back far enough. Amateurism in sport before people were actually paid. Most people think about this as being the Olympics. However, initially the Olympics weren't amateurs. They were actually athletes that were kind of paid by cities, especially if they performed well. They gave them a lot of different amenities or different gifts. And some of them even trained full time, where their profession was to perform in the Olympics, right, for the city. So even the idea that we have of amateurism isn't truly amateurism, right? They weren't paid nothing to compete. And now we think about it more as we've got these colleges. Well, the way that it kind of originated there, I believe it was crew, right? Yeah. So you had crew is like rowing, and a lot of Ivy League schools, it's a big deal. Their rowing or their crew teams. And so what ended up happening was they started hiring professionals to kind of come in and be a part of the Harvard, crew team. Right? So colleges didn't like this, right? Didn't like the fact that they were bringing in these professionals and kind of outperforming the schools that didn't. And so they said that you couldn't participate in college athletics unless if you made money off the sport, made prizes, right, in this athletic exercise or athletic endeavor. And they didn't really want it to become kind of professional sports at the collegiate level. Right? So where does that leave us today? Right, if we're looking at college sports as amateurism, right, and where they're not getting paid necessarily to play. We've got these athletic departments, and they kind of operate like a professional team in the sense that they're trying to increase profits. The problem is, right, at the college level, the athletic department is part of the university as a whole, right? So if they earn profits, what's probably going to happen? Some of those will be taken and spent in other areas, right? So they still want to maximize profits, but if all that money is just going to go somewhere else, if I'm in a college athletic program, let's say I've got $10 million of profit, as opposed to just sharing it with the rest of the university, what's one way I can always get rid of profit? Just increase my expenses, right? And so why would I give the money to another department? I'll just spend it on facilities. I'll increase my expenses because I know that I'm not really going to keep that profit, right? It's given away. Right? So we kind of have them operating like non-for-profits. Right? Their goal isn't necessarily to their goal isn't necessarily to maximize profits, but instead to maximize kind of revenues, right? So I can maximize revenues, increasing expenses, as long as I can get, where I'm breaking even. College doesn't care, I'm self-sustaining. And so we kind of think about them operating more like non-for-profits now. Okay. Now we talk about college as being, amateurism. We'll try to build this into some of the stuff that we do. Why should we probably not think about it as truly amateurism? So amateurism, the definition means that you're playing this sport with zero pay. What sort of some things that go against that? I mean, almost all the major programs are giving tuition remissions, right? And so essentially you are giving some sort of compensation. Now, we also give compensation to people for academic reasons as well. So maybe some people would argue, well, yeah, but they could have earned that not through the athletic portion. It could have been academics. And so, that's not really paying the players. What's another way you could argue it's probably not amateurism? So they get tuition remissions. But something a little bit more recent. Yeah, it's not through the university. The university's not paying them to play, but they've got these NILs, or basically they can make deals and make money with different companies, right? And Alabama's not paying their quarterback, right? Giving them any money, but playing in Alabama makes a lot of other companies want to, sign these deals with me, right? So it's not directly, right? But they have a situation where they can make money playing for these teams, not from the university, but through other means, right? So it's probably not true amateurism. We want to think about how things are going to operate a little bit differently, and think about what players might view as kind of what their wages are playing for these teams. So we'll still do a lot of labor market stuff, and think about how playing at the collegiate level would kind of change our models of the labor market. Okay. Just to kind of look at some of the numbers, and I think these are a little bit dated. I think most of the data I had was 2015 was a year. I forget what survey it was. They put out a lot of information, more detailed information on these universities. They don't do it every year, so I think that's what all of my numbers are based around. But they've probably went up a little bit since then. But just to kind of get an idea of the gravity, right? The largest football revenue school was University of Texas. They brought in over $100 million in 1 year, right? So these are large, these are larger than, if we look at the entirety of the NCAA, it's comparable to some of our professional leagues, right? So, we've also got a pretty wide variance. Unlike professional, even though we have large market teams at the professional level, there's no professional team who's only bringing in revenue of $200,000, right? So we've got a much wider variant, or a much larger variance, or a much larger variation in the kind of school quality when we're looking at collegiate sports. You look at kind of the top five, is kind of be who you would expect. Kind of these larger history programs. We'll kind of see here. We talked a little bit about like reputational effects. It's definitely going to play a role when we're looking at college athletics. But when we look at profit, they don't always match up. You see a couple schools moving in and out here. And we're thinking about profitable football teams. Maybe there's different universities where what the football program has maybe become a way to generate money to fund other sports and things like that. So maybe this idea of a non-for-profit, well, maybe they don't increase their expenses to get profits to be zero. They still want to have kind of a athletic program, right? Not athletic department. So every single athletic program benefits. So some of these schools, right, they do turn a profit, right, in order to kind of assist the entire athletic department, right? The athletic department as a whole may operate as a non-for-profit, right? They may prevent the football program from purely spending all of their revenue, so they can take some of that and spend it on smaller sports, right? So don't think about like each individual team as a non-for-profit. It's the athletic department as a whole, okay? So any, for these football teams, some of them can be profitable. I think I've got basketball as well, just kind of interesting to look at the numbers. Not quite as high of highs, but also not quite as low of lows, right? The lowest kind of revenue earning basketball program was more than double that of the lowest football program, but the largest program was about half of the largest football. Right? I think this one is mainly driven, like Louisville had a big deal at the time. This has probably changed a lot in the last couple of years because there's a lot more programs that have done big deals with, Nike, Under Armour, Air Jordan, you name the company, right? So we can kind of see, our usual suspects if you were thinking about college basketball, kind of in terms of profit and in terms of revenue. I don't know, just kind of interesting to take a look at this. I have this in the data set that we'll look at. We can play around with this in Excel, but this is kind of a snapshot of college football, college basketball, which are going to be really the two sports we primarily focus on. Because if you look at every other sport, the size of the revenues in every other sport are significantly lower. I think maybe the only other one you could kind of, if I remember right, women's basketball and I think wrestling is actually fairly, you'd be surprised at how much revenue it actually generates, right? As in the NCAA as a whole. Any one university, right, those programs may not be high revenue generators, but as a whole, those would be kind of the next two we probably look at, but they're nowhere near kind of the levels that we see men's college basketball, men's college football be at. So we'll primarily focus on those two. So why are they profitable, right? If they're generating the highest revenues, why might they, if we look at their profits, should we also be seeing like huge profit amounts? Well, the mean's only about 5.3 million, the median 0. So really what that's telling us is about a half of these programs don't actually turn a profit. In fact, I think if I do the actual calculation, only 48% did, right? So at these larger universities, you might see these football programs kind of generating some profit so that they can share it with the rest of the athletic department, and the athletic department breaks even, right? But your smaller schools, maybe having this football program, they're just trying to make it sustainable, right? And so we see a lot of schools, smaller schools, where their football programs aren't actually generating a profit. In fact, they're earning negative profits and have to be subsidized by the university, right? So one thing you may not realize is part of your tuition. I think at Ball State, I think this is the case. A lot of universities, we can actually look it up. I got the data. Let's say the football program is actually, their revenues are $100,000 less than their expenses. They will take student fees to pay for that and make up that additional amount so that it breaks even, right? So a lot of these schools, more than, right around half, are kind of relying on these subsidies, right? Same kind of thing for basketball programs. Not quite as many, require that assistance, but pretty close, right? 40, 50% aren't that far off. So let's take a look. What do I want to do here? Look at some numbers first. We'll look at some numbers first, and then we'll go to Excel so we can play around longer with that. So if we look at ticket revenue, I have kind of two time periods that we'll look at in this Excel file. And ticket sales have really grown quite a bit. So I think the growth rate was about 14%. You can also see, just like with overall revenues, there's a huge gap, right, in the ticket revenue. And this is going to be a primary source of revenue for these teams, right? One of their primary sources of income is going to be, revenue is going to be gate revenue, right? We talked about with the professional leagues, that was a large portion, but right, there was a lot of money made in broadcasting rights and all these other things. A problem at the, I'll skip ahead here. The problem with college athletics is the teams can't make, in most situations, aren't making their own broadcast deals, right? It's the NCAA or conferences that are making the deals, right? So for each individual team, they will share part of what the conference makes, but it's not like in a professional league where your largest market teams are going to be able to get the largest broadcast deals and then, initially weren't required to share it. Some leagues have kind of instituted some of those revenue sharing programs, but initially they were not. So here, each major conference now kind of has their own regional sports network, right? So the Big Ten has their own network, SEC, et cetera, right? So the conferences will make broadcasting deals or sell the rights to broadcast these games, but each individual team doesn't. Right? And so then whatever money the conference makes, they share it evenly across every team. So this idea that the conferences are the ones that are making the deals should do what to competitive balance? So if I'm thinking about maybe the Big Ten, And I've got a school like, I don't know, I'll pick on Minnesota versus, the University of Michigan, or maybe Ohio State, right? If we allow them to make their own individual broadcast deals, what school do you think, which of those schools do you think probably earns the most? Ohio State, probably Michigan, Minnesota probably couldn't sell their rights for near as much money. Right? However, if the conference makes a deal and then shares it evenly, this should help kind of close that gap, right? Everyone's getting the same amount of broadcast revenue. So when it comes to revenue numbers, we should see less variation or improved competitive balance. Right? So allowing these conferences to make the deals and not the individual teams, within conferences, we should see improved competitive balance as a result of that. Now, it's always been that way. So it's not, it's not like we're going to see, but like if we didn't have that relative to having it. So we kind of see competitive balance improves. The problem is we're going to now start to think about different levels of competitive balance. So a lot of the times I'll refer to within conference competitive balance, and then we can think about league-wide or across conference balance. Right? So if I'm thinking about, I have these major kind of Power 5 conferences that are the largest revenue generators, and that's a pretty big step down from there. So because every team in these conferences is going to be splitting evenly this broadcast revenue, across those Power 5, we should see competitive balance improve. But if we're thinking across all conferences, so that would include the MAC, that would include the Mountain West, all these other conferences that have a lot smaller programs who, quite frankly, some of them probably aren't even, selling any broadcast rights. Like if you go down, low enough. And so if these main Power 5 conferences can sign these huge broadcast revenue deals, what's going to happen to a cross-conference competitive balance? Well, you're now going to have 5 earning, every team in there getting an equal amount. So they're all kind of having a pretty large amount of broadcast revenue, while your lower quality conferences are receiving hardly any. And so you're going to get kind of a decrease in competitive balance, or competitive balance would get worse across all the conferences. Right? But if you look within any one of these Power 5 conferences, there's going to be improved competitive balance across just that set of teams. So this is kind of played out over time. You can kind of look at, you can actually go out and grab some of like the win data and then calculate standard deviations and win percentages within each conference across the entire NCAA. And what you see is that these standard deviations, right, are much, much lower within each one of these conferences than when you look at the standard deviation and win percentage across every conference. Right? I mean, to put this in a maybe less technical way, Ohio State and Michigan play MAC schools and beat up on them at the beginning of the season every year, right? And so that's kind of hurting across conference competitive balance. However, when they play within, there's been, even in light of some success of certain schools like Alabama or even Ohio State, you still get turnover at the top. And you still see teams within these Power 5 conferences, the lower quality teams will still even occasionally beat the higher quality team within that conference. So we see an improvement in competitive balance within conference, but not across as a result of this. There are some teams that have their own network deals, or we have examples of this. Notre Dame for the longest time had one with NBC. I think Texas has their own network, so they can make their own deals, but the conference has to allow it, right? So the conference allowed Texas. I don't know. This will be interesting to see. I haven't looked into this because they're moving conferences, what this will do. I don't know the differences in the rules of, what was it, the Big 12 and the SEC. I wonder if they'll still maybe take a portion of that, allow them to, I think what the Big 12 was, or allow them to have the network, but took a certain proportion, right? Portion of revenues. Okay, so, the other thing I wanted to mention here, you can also see additional broadcast revenue that could be earned by these teams if they make it into bowl games or from tournament success. So when you think about broadcast revenue here, it's kind of indirectly going to come from the fact that when they have success, there's generally payouts for getting into certain bowls and payouts for just making it in the NCAA tournament. I've got it outlined in the slide here in a little bit, but largely where is that money coming from? Why is the NCAA giving these schools money for making a tournament? Well, because it's generating a large amount of broadcast revenue for the NCAA as a whole. Okay? So we'll see that play out as well. Usually this is going to end up hurting competitive balance because it's only the schools that make it into the tournament that get a proportion of the NCAA tournament broadcast revenue, right? The only teams awarded money are teams that make it in. However, the rule is that that money is required to be kind of shared with the rest of the conference, right? So if you're sharing with the rest of the conferences that get the most teams in are going to have a larger amount to share with every team in the conference. And you kind of see, once again, improved competitive balance within conference, but the Big Ten is getting way more schools in than, the MAC, right? So across competitive balance is also going to be hurt by this awarding a portion of overall broadcast revenue that comes from the NCAA tournament or from these bowls. Okay. So same kind of effects as we had from the conferences making their own kind of deals. I skipped over one, which is licensing revenue. This is a pretty significant proportion of some of these schools' kind of revenue, although, it gets a little bit tricky here. It's hard to differentiate how much of the licensing revenue to attribute to the athletic department and how much to attribute to just the university as a whole. People who aren't interested in Ball State football at all may still own Ball State apparel, right? And so it's a little bit harder to kind of break out what percent of this is going to be attributed to the athletic department or not. But certainly you could argue that football specific apparel licenses for, video games who are using, their trademark or their logos, all of that you can kind of wrap up. They are going to be earning some licensing revenue as well, just like professional teams. So we've got kind of the same areas of revenue as we did for professional teams. And we can kind of look at some of the broadcast revenue earned across these different conferences. We look at the Power Five. They're pretty similar. I mean, the SEC is a little bit higher. The Big 12 is a little bit lower here. But, there's not near the kind of wide range that we saw when we look at things like ticket revenue. So they're all earning kind of substantial amounts of money. If we add these up, right, in any given year, it's looking like, over $1.5 billion here. That's pretty significant, right? So we'll return to this here in a second. I want to look at this data where I was kind of pulling some of these numbers from. So actually, since I've got this pulled up, if you want to have it open along with me, I'll put this in the data in class folder. So where was this at? Got my subsidy data. I'll kind of drop that over here. Okay. So it's that subsidy data Econ 330. I'll zoom in so we can actually see what I'm doing. Okay. So like I said, I can't remember. There was something through the NCAA. I have this first sheet and it's got 2010 as well as the 2015 data. You can kind of notice the 2010 data had a bunch of missing variables over here that wasn't missing for a lot of 2015. So I kind of put 2015 on a separate sheet. It's also more recent. So we'll kind of take a look. So I've got it all filtered so we can kind of sort on any one of these variables, but it breaks the revenues down into these different components. So I've got licensing, I've got contributions. So this is kind of like from donors, what the student fees, right? How much money from student fees went to the athletic department, school funding, etc. Ticket sales, total revenue. So one thing that's interesting. So what schools would you expect to have higher kind of student fees? Where are we at? Let me see if I can. There we go. What schools would you expect would need student fees to help subsidize the football program? Yeah, probably the non-Power 5 smaller schools, ones that aren't generating as much revenue, right? So if we just do like a quick sort here, we'll go from smallest to largest, scroll over. Ohio State, Michigan, Texas, all of these have 0 student fees, right? In fact, the first kind of school, LSU looks like that's not LSU, this is Louisiana Monroe, right? Some of your kind of smaller programs there, you might be surprised to see some schools like Oregon State in there, right? But maybe they needed it at one time, and once students were okay paying it, why would I not keep taking it from them, right? And so, if we had a longer history, it would be interesting to see it when these schools kind of instituted their student fees, right? But at least looking at those ones that have student fees of 0. That's not the right variable. Where is it at? There we are. Right. These are kind of our Power 5 conferences and kind of the schools we would expect probably are earning pretty high revenues. They don't need any additional money from their students. Okay. However, there's going to be kind of a trade-off. So even schools that have 0 student fees, right, they may still require some subsidies from the university. So even if it's not through student fees, maybe it's coming from somewhere else, right? From contributions that are just given to the university. So let me see. I think one of these student revenue subsidies. Yeah, let's not worry about that. We'll just look at the subsidies here. So you can kind of notice, like, even though some of these schools have 0 subsidies, or sorry, subsidies, 0 student fees, they're still receiving some subsidies from the university, right? And if we go down far enough, you can kind of look at, there's some schools who are receiving large amounts of subsidies, and they're primarily all student fees, right? So those subsidies include both student fees and additional subsidies. So you kind of notice here, this university, all their subsidies are from student fees, but like here, some of it's not, right? And so we can kind of think about there could be a trade-off between the two, right? If I had more money coming not from student fees, I wouldn't need to increase them as much. I don't think they will be, only because I believe this is only public universities, because they don't have to disclose their data, so they usually don't. So we can scroll down. Yeah, Notre Dame isn't in here. So any private school doesn't have to disclose their data, and so a lot of times it's impossible to get like detailed data like this.
Would we expect, like, it's like Notre Dame is just one that's independent,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of conference, we expect to see probably like different subsidy amounts for them just because they lack certain revenues from. Like, I know you said TVD is similar, but
Yeah, so they at one time, not belonging to a conference, right, was actually a huge benefit to them. So when they're successful, they are able to make their own deals, right? And they, we think about large, small market. With universities, it gets a little bit hard because it's not the city that they're located in, it's what their fan base is. And that usually depends on things like the length of time that school has been around, their previous success or previous quality. And so they were signing deals with NBC that were much larger than what any one school within the Power 5 was able to keep, right? Because within the Power 5, Michigan, if I allowed Michigan, Ohio State to go out and make their own TV deals, they could probably get just as much as Notre Dame. The problem is they have to share some of that with these smaller schools in their conference. So Notre Dame was actually at a pretty good point.
yeah.
The problem is, what's the benefit of being in a conference? What happens when I'm not high quality?
Yeah, that's stability.
Exactly, right? When my team doesn't do as well, I can't sell my broadcast rights for as much, right? But if I'm in a conference, right, at least I'm getting some of the revenue coming from the schools that are currently at a performing well. So this is, I think it just took time for Notre Dame to have enough bad seasons to where what happened? They like quasi joined a conference, right? Not necessarily for wholeheartedly for football, but some of their other programs, they are now in these conferences where they share some of the revenue that's made. So I think that's it kind of plays out exactly what we're saying. That's kind of what we saw play out. But yeah, I think the only schools in here would be public schools. So I think Ball State's in here, so we can actually take a look at them. Here we are. So right, you can kind of look and see how much you're paying. So we've got like total revenue. Here's subsidies. Here's our student fees. So there's quite, what's the difference? Is it $6 million? $6 million difference between student fees and what the subsidies are. So the university subsidizes the athletic department quite a bit here, not just with student fees, but with money that's coming from other areas of the university as well. Right. And also that's a lot. I mean, $11 million annually kind of generated from you guys to help pay for the football program. Puts things into perspective a little bit, right? And ticket sales are at $609,000. So, there's a lot of people who argue, athletic departments can sometimes be a pretty big suck on the university as a whole. But I think one paper, I don't think we looked at it yet. We haven't looked at the paper that looks at athletic performance and then the subsequent increases or decreases in like admissions or applications to universities, right? Okay, I use this in a lot of my classes, so I always forget if we went over it yet. But there's a lot of research that we'll eventually talk about where potentially even just having a program, even if it's not successful, can generate an increase in the number of students. You've got more students to choose from. You can be a little pickier so you can get higher quality students. So there's some kind of like externalities, positive externalities to having these programs, even if they aren't generating large amounts of revenue. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask if, like, if there's any way to see the negative externalities, like, because that's a lot of money from the student fees. A lot of people aren't going to
Attend the games.
attend the game or be in any of the facilities.
Yep.
And I just don't know where the trade-off happens between investing more in like actual regular stuff, in education or sports.
Yeah, so this is like a tough, this is a multifaceted issue, right? And I think I would probably agree with your sentiment in the sense that for the current students, sometimes, it's almost obvious, like they're paying, and if they're not going to the games, which based off the ticket sales, it's looking like probably not, as many of them are, then all of those students are going to be basically a example of the negative externality exists, right? Having this football program draws money away from these people who aren't even involved in that market, right? They're not involved in attending the game. They're not involved in, even watching the games on TV. And so they are the negative externality, like they're experiencing the negative externality. I think the university views it as a long-term decision, right? And so it's not how it's necessarily impacting current students, it's how can we get to these goals that we want? And if not having a D1 football program means that we're going to see a decrease in the number of applications we get every year, it means we're going to have a decrease in the exposure, national exposure. It sounds dumb, but like I said, I know there's some research we'll look at, and just getting your name out there, like schools see. So, for instance, if teams make it into the NCAA tournament, they see an increase in the number of applications the following year. This is even like greater of an effect if it's a school that's not from the Power Five, because until you see, Oral Roberts pop up in the NCAA tournament, someone named a university that, right? So it's like people weren't even aware, unless maybe the example I use is because a lot of people are from Indiana, is, if you ask somebody from California, even where Ball State's that they may not know, let alone a school like Valparaiso that occasionally will happen to pop up in the NCAA tournament. So for them, it's not free marketing because they are paying to have this program, but it's huge exposure, right? It's huge advertising for your university. Same kind of idea. Even if you don't have a good football program, but University of Michigan or Notre Dame chooses you to beat up on that first or second game of the season, well, you got on national television. Your school is out there, right? And so it's really hard to measure what the total impacts of that would be. I've never seen it broken down by in-state versus out-of-state students, but my guess is the increase in applications is probably primarily coming from like out-of-state, right? Where you're just made aware that there's this university nearby. You start looking into it. Oh, they've got a great, XYZ program. I'm interested in that. And so you're just essentially like a product, right? Advertising. Now people are aware of the product, right? They may want to buy it. If they weren't aware of that your university existed, they were never going to apply. And so I agree with you. Sucks if you're a current student and you're a parent, right? But the university is looking at how can we increase our student body, the quality of our student body over time. Right? Sorry, that was a much longer answer than probably you wanted, but yeah. But that is the idea, right? And yeah, I think you could probably argue there's some moral issues with maybe students not realizing that they're even paying these fees. That's just all packaged into your tuition. I think, I'm probably a little bit too libertarian in that, like, I feel like you should get like a complete printout. Like every time we pay taxes, we should get a complete printout of like what it's going for. You should see what all your tuition goes, like, but that's never going to happen. So here we are. All right, where is the Ball State one? There we go. So we'll look at all the universities again. Let's kind of point out a few more things here. So we're not overly surprised that kind of our highest revenue generating programs aren't requiring student fees, right? Kind of take a look. There's some other interesting variables here. You can kind of look at what percent of overall revenue is coming from ticket sales. This kind of shows you how important ticket revenue can be, even for those large programs. You're talking upwards of 30%. Let's sort this though and see some of these small ones. So some of them that aren't, don't have high ticket sales at all. So these are like some of your max schools, right? They're not generating near as much money in ticket sales, right? Look at the subsidy amounts, right? They're much, much larger, right? So the only way they can kind of keep these programs going is through subsidies. And some of them have found ways to do it without using student fees. They've taken money from other areas of the university, which is still kind of indirectly taking money from you, right? Because that money could have been used to provide the students with other things, but it's not directly taking money out of the pockets of students. You can also think about, let's say I had a pretty low ticket sales, and I didn't have any subsidies or student fees. What's the only other way that that might be possible? Is if I have huge kind of alumni contributions. So kind of look at here, see the schools that have the largest alumni contributions. Well, obviously it's going to be some large schools. So let's try to find a relatively small school here. What's the first one? It's not that large. Let's see. East Carolina is not too big. So you can kind of look at East Carolina. Let's see, I need to remember what column we're in. So here's student fees. Here's East Carolina. Right, so even with large contributions, right, it still doesn't always help alleviate the necessity of student fees. So they had some pretty large alumni contributions, but they still required a pretty large amount of student fees to make up for these relatively small ticket sales. Right? But you can imagine theoretically, if I could have alumni contributions be high enough, I may not need to rely on those student fees near as much. Okay. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, you could play around this data a little bit more. I think I had here from 2010 to 2015, they see like a decline or an increase in fees. There's not much we can really do with this in just this data set. You can merge this into like win data and maybe find some interesting things. But yeah, so I want to show you the data that I was kind of pulling those numbers in the slides from. I just talk a little bit more broadly about thinking about where the revenue is coming from for these athletic departments. So here we go. So we'll return this idea of part of kind of quote unquote broadcast revenue that these teams might be earning is when they make it into a bowl or into the NCAA tournament. Okay. So I don't remember, I don't think I've seen what if they're working on a new deal, right? It should be up here relatively soon, right? So 14-year deal. Yeah. So the NCAA is going to be, probably already in talks of what their next deal is going to be in terms of selling their broadcast rights. So in 2010, I mean, 14-year deal worth almost $11 billion. I've got to imagine they've increased the number of games in the tournament since then. I think there's probably been an increase in interest. And so expecting it's probably quite a bit larger than that. So it'll be interesting to see what it is. But currently they've got this huge deal. So the NCAA received overall $680 million annually. So this, I believe, was just with those two companies. They can sell other games to other companies as well. And so $680 million annually is made from broadcast revenue, which is 90% of the NCAA's revenue, right? So it's not like the NCAA is really selling anything but the broadcasting rights. They're not actually putting on games. The teams are, right? They're not actually selling the apparel. The universities are selling their own. They have no rights to their own apparel. So primarily the NCAA exists because they can sell the rights to these games, right? Broadcast rights. Then another year where they extended this. So I guess made another $8.8 billion in the extension. So how is this going to help improve competitive balance? So I already alluded to this a little bit. but 60% of the revenues are going to go directly to colleges. And the amount that they get is based off the number of scholarships. So what's going to be a problem already with this? So if the number of scholarships available that a university has to offer, if the amount of money they receive from the NCAA is increasing with the number of scholarships, your larger kind of programs are going to be the ones who are getting a larger amount of money. So instantly, you're going to have kind of a decrease or worsening of competitive balance as a result of this. Right? Now, they could change this, right, to something that might be a little bit more equitable, but currently, based off the number of scholarships, this is going to decrease competitive balance. Right? So the way that they give out the money in terms of actually making the tournament, so 60% of it just goes to the schools based off the number of scholarships. The remaining 40% is given out as awards to making it into the tournament. So the conference itself gets 1.5 million if it simply has a school appear in the tournament. Right. So this year, I don't know, however many Big Ten teams made it, multiply that by 1.5. That's how much the Big Ten got. Right? Excuse me. And then for every additional win that a team from that tournament gets, the conference gets an additional $250,000. Right. And that's for the following 6 years. So having success, so this is why when these small schools have success, you start to see them maybe have a little bit more, start showing up kind of year after year. Not to mention they have similar players, but even after those players leave, they can still maintain some level of quality because they get that $250,000 for the next 6 years. I think this was 2018. I don't know if I have the year on this. This was the 2018 data. I tried to grab something prior to like 2018-19, sorry. Started in 2018 before COVID stuff because that kind of screwed with some things. So you kind of see different conferences made different amounts of money. Your Power Five kind of were the highest there, but you've got some other schools in NCAA basketball that don't pop up as much in football. And so pretty even amounts of money given out kind of across these conferences. The problem is going to be money doesn't really make as much of a difference. So even though we're giving out money to only teams that make it into the tournament, if we just for a second say conditioned on that a conference has a team in the tournament, to which of these conferences will that additional $1.5 million have the greatest effect? Well, if I give the University of Michigan, 1/12, because there's 12 teams in the Big Ten, of $1.5 million, or however much money the Big Ten gets, what was it here? The additional $2 million from winning. Well, 1/12 of $2 million isn't going to have near as much of an impact for the University of Michigan as if I gave that same amount of money to Valparaiso University, right? And so the idea that as I have more money, the marginal value of each additional dollar is decreasing, right? That first dollar I have is a lot more effective than the 1,000,001th dollar that I have, right? The value of money is decreasing as I have more of it. These awards are going to have much greater impact, right, on our smaller conferences or these smaller schools as opposed to these large conferences. So even though they're receiving a larger amount of money, the kind of marginal value of each one of those additional dollars is going to be less in those big conferences. So that kind of helps this not kind of make competitive balance too bad, right? Or not kind of move it too far in the direction of being out of balance. So I want to kind of mention that here. So even though the dollar amounts might be higher in some of these larger conferences, for the small conferences that make it in, even though they might only get one team in, well, each additional dollar for each one of those small conference teams is going to be much more impactful. Because maybe before they didn't have a practice facility, right? So whereas, Michigan, is going to, what are they going to spend it on, additional money on? Probably just more recruiting, right? And so they're already spending a large amount. So how much, marginal impact is that really going to have? Not near as much as for these small programs. Okay. I think I did the 2000. This was last year. I guess I did update it. You can kind of see like every team gets these. A lot of these teams got these automatic bids. I think here this is 0 because I think I had the play-in game set, so it was only if you were in the top 64. But by guaranteeing that each conference has at least one team in the tournament, what is that going to do to competitive balance? Yeah, right. Make sure that one of these teams from a small conference makes it in. It's almost guaranteeing they get 1.5 million, even if they don't win a game, right? It was 1.5 flat fee for each team, and then 250,000 for each additional win, right? And we know that the money given to those small conferences has a much higher marginal value, right? So this really helps improve competitive balance when they created this tournament by ensuring that every conference is guaranteed one team, right, into the tournament. Any questions on anything at this point? Yeah.
Where does that money come from? Is that just from previous revenues?
These broadcast deals.
Oh, just broadcast.
I mean, primarily, like I said, I don't know if it's on this slide. I think it was it's just over 90% of the NCAA's revenues from broadcast revenue. I'm sure, I think those numbers are specific to the tournament. So the NCAA makes money off selling bowl games as well, which we'll talk about here in a second. But this is just money made off the tournament, or not just tournament, but rights to other games as well that they're able to sell. So they'll kind of take that money. They obviously have some expenses as an institution, but they take a large portion of it. I forget. So 60% is given based on scholarships. I forget how much of the remaining they get, but that's where the money's coming from is these broadcast deals they sign. Yep. And, I mean, when you're talking about giving 1.5 million out for every team, when you made 8.8, it's not like they're gonna run out of money anytime soon. Let me see if there's anything interesting here. Anything else I wanted to say here? So let's think about what the NCAA has to do, because I think it's a lot harder than what we might think of initially. So I've guaranteed that every conference gets one team in to this tournament, right? That helps improve competitive balance as a result of ensuring that those conferences are getting some money, right? Some portion of this broadcast revenue. But why is broadcast revenue so high for the tournament? Well, because people want to watch these games. There's high demand. But what's probably true about the 1/16 games versus the 8-9 games, if you looked at TV viewership? I mean, do you sit down and watch the 1/16 game from tip off to the end? I mean, you kind of assume you already know the outcome, right? The 8-9 game is a toss-up. It's probably going to be a much more interesting game in that first round. So it comes back to this idea of not just competitive balance over the season, but competitive balance of a game, right? The uncertainty of the outcome of a game will impact the demand for that game. So they've got this really complicated problem of, we want to make sure that over the long run, we're getting improved competitive balance. We want the quality of that 1/16 team to get even closer, right? But every year, the only reason why we can ensure that and give money to these small schools is because we can generate so much broadcast revenue. Well, how can I increase how much companies are willing to pay, increase the demand for each game? Well, there I need to make sure that my 16 team isn't so bad then that this one game, basically the company paying for my broadcast deals doesn't care about. They're really only looking at these games that drive high viewership, right? So they're wanting to try to ensure that they're kind of getting the wealth spread evenly across these conferences without decreasing, right, the demand for each game, or kind of making games more certain, right, in those earlier rounds. So I think one thing that they've done that is like brilliant, and I don't know if they'll ever expand it. Like I don't know if I have this. I don't think I put a slide in here. Well, let's just Google it. Why not? So NCAA tournament revenue by year. Let's say I want to do timeline. I know there's one that exists. I think this probably doesn't go far enough. No. Oh, here we go. I think this might be newer time periods. No, I don't want 2013. So I know that there's a graph that exists where you can look at the revenue made. Well, I'll just draw out what it looks like. I can remember it from memory because it's so crazy. So I forget the exact year when they started allowing or having these playing games, but it's wild how just that additional game, you see like revenue is increasing over time, but then you get to where they have these playing games and it like takes this, like, I didn't even draw this as much, but it takes a much larger jump, right? And then they add in even more and you saw like this huge jump. So initially it was just, wasn't initially just 2 games, if I'm remembering correctly, and then expanded it to 4. And the reason why you can generate so much revenue with those games is because what do they do to make sure that it's a more uncertain outcome? Those playing games are a 16 versus a 16 or a 11 versus an 11, right? They're guaranteeing that some of their early games are very uncertain and that will be, very competitive games. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you see them kind of expand this, right? So they can kind of get more of these early games where they know that they can have very uncertain outcomes and would have high demand, right? And just package even more high demand games in there. These broadcast companies are going to be willing to pay even more now for this package because it has more games, and those games are also going to have high viewership. But yeah, I wish I could have found that. Maybe I'll bring it. I'll bring in the discussion on the video I post Thursday because it's interesting to see how much of a jump kind of just including those had. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say before I go to kind of the football stuff. I already talked about some of this. We'll save some of the regulatory stuff. So I guess we'll just kind of go interesting here. Okay. So we have the same sort of thing happening with bowl games, right? And we can think about how awarding money there, it's going to have really similar effects. So right, the BCS and these playoff games, they want to attract high viewership. Here, teams get $6 million just for making it into kind of this one of these playoff games, right? And then conferences receive money for each bowl game they have a direct tie-in. So here, it's a little bit different than this NCAA tournament, where in the NCAA tournament, there's no direct money given to a team. It's all given to the conference. Here, the team gets money for making it, right? And the conference gets some additional money if it had a team make it into the college playoff, right? So they also get money for a stipend to spend while they're like down in whatever warm state they're at, playing these bowl games. So it's not just the additional $6 million, they're giving additional money for expenses, which kind of, I think, just looking at these numbers, I mean, I know there's a lot more teams in the tournament, but than in the college football playoff, but right, this is a pretty substantial amount of money. In 2019, the Big Ten, because of all the bowls they made it into, and $90 million to split evenly across those teams. If we think about the numbers that we're seeing from the tournament, I mean, even if every Big Ten team made it, I don't think that they and like won as many possible games, they still wouldn't be able to get to that $90 million. So there's a lot more money in football, which must mean what's true about the broadcast rights to some of these bowl games. Must be selling for higher amounts of money, right? And I think like one of the values there is for these bowl games is they don't have to sell them as one gigantic package. They can really like break them down and sell off each game individually if they want to. Whereas they're not going to do that for the NCAA tournament. They're going to sell to a small set of kind of broadcast companies. So what does this do? Well, what teams are more likely to make it to these bowl games? Teams from these Power 5 conferences. So yeah, they'll be getting money to share with the rest of their conference. So within conference competitive balance, once again, will improve because just like with the broadcast rights, if they're getting money from the NCAA, the conference then shares it evenly with every team. That's going to help kind of improve the low quality teams in the conference to kind of improve that within conference competitive balance. But across the conferences, for these conferences that don't have many teams make it into the bowl games, it's going to hurt across conference competitive balance. Okay? And you could even have, if you see the Power 5 begin to some of them start to have a large number of teams making it in, and some of your Power Five start to have a smaller and smaller number, it could eventually even drive worse in the competitive balance across the Power Five conferences. Maybe if the SEC kind of rises in quality above the rest of the Power Five, well, then now whenever they play a non-SEC school, you get kind of worsening competitive balance. And maybe during the regular, I guess, season, the NCAA probably isn't as concerned with that because the majority of your games are played in conference. But what's your main generators, like main money generators in terms of the NCAA for selling off broadcast rights? Bowl games and then the college playoff football series. Well, if the SEC starts to get too high of quality so that we have worsened competitive balance across the Power Five with the SEC, well, now those college football championship games aren't worth as much money because it's likely I'm going to get an SEC school versus a non-SEC school. Right? And so they want to make sure that they don't see worsening competitive balance across these Power Five as well. Okay? But there's so many bowl games, right? I think that's why they they started increasing the number of bowl games to ensure that these, even if we have one of the conferences kind of lagging behind, they're still receiving money from getting some teams into, a significant number of teams into bowl games year after year. I don't know if I want to say too much here. I forget. I think this is some older data. I mean, it's changed a lot, but you can kind of see your Power Five conferences. The Big East is kind of, I guess, right behind them there. You could argue, what's the Power Five? Is there really a big difference in the Big 12 and the Big East, especially now that Oklahoma and Texas left, right? So it'll be interesting to see how these numbers kind of change from there. But there's a huge drop off after that, right? I mean, down to the Conference USA, it's a pretty big drop off. So we should expect to see, this across conference competitive balance is probably not going to be great in NCAA football because we're almost guaranteed we're going to have more teams making into bowl games, more teams making into that college playoff from the Power Five, or I guess if you want to say Power Six, than the rest of these small conferences. I don't know how much I want to go into this right now because I think we'll dive into the next class. All right, so I wanted to kind of introduce the idea of college athletics, start to think about within conference and across conference competitive balances, think about different revenue sources. So on Thursday, I'll probably dive a little bit more into kind of the NCAA as kind of a cartel. I'll add in some more slides. So I'll get some slides posted up there for what I'll go over on Thursday. It's called Week 12 lecture slides. But this was kind of interesting, an article that I wanted to take a look at, and then I can get it to open. There we go. Oh, so scroll down to kind of see what their results were here. So, well, I'll hold off on this. I don't really, we don't have to go the whole time today. So I've got a few things I want to mention that are kind of unrelated. So we'll stop there with kind of content for today. I've just got a couple questions I'll ask you guys. So Thursday we'll have class. I'll put up that additional video. So I think originally it had the early project submission date was like last Friday, and I kind of forgot that was, then I forgot to mention it. So if you do have kind of a version of your project that you want to have me take a look at, if you turn it in by the end of the week, I'll try to take a look at them a lot. I'll have some time this weekend to take a look at them and kind of get you some comments back to you sometime next week. So if you want to turn in an early version, I'm going to post something on Canvas that is kind of for the project. You can kind of, it's like project early submission or something like that. So you can kind of upload it there and I'll kind of take a look at it. If you have any questions, hopefully, you're starting to work with that data that I sent you. And so if you have questions on that, some of you have reached out, I want to help you with that, even if it's over the next couple of days, like Thursday, Friday, even if you want to do it virtually, it's pretty easy for me to help you with the data portion virtually because you can show me your screen. So Thursday or Friday, if you want to set up a time to do that, we can try to work something out. Otherwise, over the next couple of weeks, if you want to stop by, get some help during office hours or set up a time that's not during office hours. Hope after this week, I should be kind of back to completely available. So that's kind of where we're at with that. We have this third homework assignment. It's going to do this week. That fourth we'll do in a few weeks. And I'll probably put up a fifth assignment for those last couple weeks of the course that are kind of meant to be an assignment, but also kind of like additional problems that you could see on the exam. And so kind of expect that, kind of the last couple weeks having that fifth assignment. Okay. Any questions from you before we kind of? I'm also going to put up an online quiz that just has some more, it won't be like content related questions. I've just got some generalized questions about to see where I take the direction at the end of this class. So usually after we kind of cover college athletics, I kind of leave it open to topics that people are interested in. And so kind of getting an idea, getting some feedback from you about what you might want to see. I think the last 2 years, and I've got a bunch of stuff ready to go for it, is sports gambling is a big one. So that's usually something we could take a look at. There's some other topics though that there's a pretty good amount of research out there that we can kind of start to look at a few papers, and I can kind of talk through some of the different economic models that we could use in those areas. So just kind of more some preference-based questions. I'll get that posted as soon as I get back to my office. And as long as you fill that out before we meet next Tuesday, then that's on time. It'll be 2 before we start class on next Tuesday. Don't forget about it. So I would suggest try to get it done either today after I post it or tomorrow, or like in the relatively near future. If you need help on that homework, like I said, I could likely do some Zoom meetings Thursday in the afternoon or on Friday. If you do need some last minute kind of help, since I won't be having office hours as usual on Thursday. Other than that, any questions for me before we kind of conclude here today? Get out a little bit early. Okay. We're a little bit ahead of schedule here, so that kind of works out pretty nice for us. Oh, I think I thought I had it pulled up, and I think I searched something over it, but the end results didn't kind of change any. Will, Dan, first and second. So I will kind of add in some additional points to those online quizzes, since almost all of you beat me. But the other thing I was going to mention, I saw something the other day that was relevant to the class, and now I'm forgetting what it was. So we were talking about discrimination. I think it was something to do with the I think that it was really relevant. What's the team? The U.S. soccer team, women's soccer team, right? They had like some sort of, let's see if we can find it here real quick before we leave. I think they had a lawsuit. Yeah, that they weren't paid as much as the men's team. And I think this was for not the Olympics, right, but the World Cup. Yeah. So they actually, I believe, won. I just saw like the outcome, like they won some amount of money. And so what would have had to be, so what they did is, if you look at the revenues, they're not near as high for the women's game, or like viewership, things like that, or the broadcast rights don't sell for as much. What they did is they took like a percentage base, like how much the women were receiving from that. And that was like their main support behind why they were being underpaid, which our models will predict, right? Even if you see this increase in demand, right? Even if demand for the men's sport was twice as high, well, then it should be that wages are half as much, right? But it was like, the factor was like 1/8 as much, right? Even though it was only a double. And so they kind of looked at this and kind of showed that there was some evidence of discrimination going on. And I believe that they won that fight. So kind of interesting. It's, there are, I'm guessing some of the people that were involved in this, right? There are economists who actually are consultants for lawyers, and they try to like estimate, like look at the revenues and try to estimate these things. So I thought it was kind of somewhat relevant, pretty current event that we kind of could think about building models of gender discrimination. We've looked at a few. Okay. All right. Any questions for you out of here? That's the last thing, I promise. Okay. All right. So I'll get that short video posted probably sometime tomorrow in replace of Thursday's class. Other than that, I will see you guys on Tuesday, a week from today, okay?